Oklahoma put up 52 points on Saturday against TCU. That's the way it's supposed to be, right? Welcome to the Voice of College Football and our Oklahoma Sooners live show right here that we present to you each and every Wednesday, 11:30 Central Time. So lock it in, be here, especially for the live version. But we understand if you're watching us on replay and that's the only way you can catch us, certainly that's a good way to go as well. We got Jason Ray on the line. As always, he's made it happen for 25 consecutive shows. You can catch Jason's work at Last Word on College Football. Hey, Jason.
Hey, Mark. How you doing, brother?
I'm good. How you doing?
Oh, good.
You know, that game on Saturday night, we will delve into in just a decent quality opponent, but nowhere near their competition where it was close. It was, into the first, second quarter. Then it started to expand and even more and more. And a one-score game turned into 2 scores and then 3 scores and was pretty comfortable by the finish. But we will get to TCU and then look ahead to mighty Kansas here in just a few minutes. But first, we want to catch everyone up on the latest news that if you're a big Oklahoma fan, you probably are aware of. But let's dig a little deeper. So Gentry Williams has been a player that we've talked about numerous occasions, and certainly you have done some work on Last Word on College Football as you cover Oklahoma football, even beyond what we've talked about here. But top-rated player in the state of Oklahoma, 9th-rated cornerback, number 65 rated player according to the 247 Sports Composite. So that is extremely high status for him at 6 feet 170. But Gentry Williams has made his decision.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. So, as you mentioned, we've talked a lot about this big in-state kid for Oklahoma to get. I think one of the things with him is he is very much an advocate of the state of Oklahoma. So I think he very much wanted to come to Oklahoma. However, I think through the recruiting period, he had a couple of really good. I think there was a couple of really good opportunities for him outside of Oklahoma. I think USC was one that really kind of dazzled him. I think Florida was another one that really kind of dazzled him. I think luckily for Oklahoma, he made his official. Well, it was an unofficial visit because only the home team is allowed to bring recruits to the Oklahoma-Texas game. But he went there for an unofficial visit, and it was, it's outstanding for him. He rated it 10 out of 10 overall. So I think that, among some other things, has kind of moved the needle for him to Oklahoma. So as you mentioned, he made his verbal commitment to Oklahoma on Monday. One of the number one player in the state of Oklahoma, very much a position of need for the Sooners, and I'm sure we'll get into that on some of the struggles that Oklahoma's had in the secondary. But yeah, I think it's a good sign. I think Oklahoma has started. It's a long discussion that we've had just about the state of Oklahoma recruiting, just in terms of what some of the misses that they've had in the past. But they've done really well this year. I think from a recruiting perspective, they got about three in-state recruits, and then there's one more, Chris McClellan, that they're kind of working on as well, a defensive lineman out of Owasso. So I think he's it's a group of need, I think, I think specifically from a defensive lineman perspective as well. But no, I think this is good. Gets them to, I think, around number 8 overall in the 2022 rankings. Certainly that will ebb and flow a bit, but I think this is big, and I think there's a little bit of a Caleb Williams effect. We talked a little bit offline about this, Mark, but I think one of the things that he has traditionally, even last year, but certainly now that he's more kind of from a starting perspective, gets a little bit more notoriety that way. But one thing he's been very vocal on social media about getting some of these kids and really kind of recruiting, helping their recruiting on behalf of the coaches. So I think that's kind of a win-win on both sides.
McClellan is also out of the state of Oklahoma, as Jason outlines right there. He is the 3rd-rated player in the state, 20th rated defensive lineman in the country. This is according to the 247 Sports Composite, number 103 nationally. So again, depending on your engagement with recruiting, these numbers may not mean a lot, or you may have a certain judgment, but a top 100 player in the country is extremely high. 6'3", 295. And The scouting report from 247 Sports likens him to Davon Hamilton, who was an interior player for Ohio State, Jacksonville Jaguars currently. So they're making that comparison, which is always a gauge just to give people an idea of what type of player that particular prospect could turn out to be, or has that type of size and characteristics to their game.
Yeah, no, that's fair, Mark. And I think the two biggest areas I think of intrigue, I think for Oklahoma fans, and the two biggest positions of need probably is defensive line and wide receiver. As you mentioned there about Chris McClellan, another kid, Hero Canoe, who came in for an official visit, was really really good, 6'5", 293. I think he's got a couple of crystal balls to Oklahoma right now, so it's looking positive for him. Azare Thomas is another kid. He's classified as an athlete, maybe more so on the wide receiver side of it. So Oklahoma, as we've talked again, they've had 3 wide receiver commits that have decommitted and gone elsewhere. Just recently, Luther Burden, who was one of the best wide receiver commits in the country, decommitted from Oklahoma probably about a month or so ago and has committed to Missouri verbally. So there's some thoughts that was really kind of more NIL related, just in terms of him kind of getting the idea that his earning potential was a little bit better being kind of local to a Missouri, from a Missouri kid. So I think those are the areas of I think most intrigue in the areas of need, because you got to think that Oklahoma's probably gonna have 3 guys that are very pivotal to the success this year. That's probably going to leave the program to go to the NFL. Perion Winfrey, Isaiah Thomas, and Nick Benito, all 3 most likely will be gone after this year. So that's going to be a big area of need, just to supplement the talent that's already on campus.
Remington, we appreciate the question. Want to remind everyone that this is the way we set it up, is Jason and I have plenty to talk about. We will always fill an hour plus by ourselves, but we definitely want your comments and questions, debate topics in the live chat, and we get to as many as possible. Typically, I believe we get to just about all of them each and every week. So please leave your comments and questions in the live chat, but also keep in mind, as we're going to steer this toward the TCU conversation, that I'm not going to hit Jason up on too much concerning TCU, that you can catch his entire post-game show that obviously just transpired this past Saturday night in the 52-31 win over TCU. But Jason's here each and every week after the OU game, so please check his post-game show where he answers all your questions and gives his take on Oklahoma's latest effort. So the one thing before we get to Remington's question and dive into the quarterbacks, because of course everyone wants to talk about that, is is there anything in addition to the obvious against TCU that really struck you as a continuing concern, a new concern, or maybe something that, hey, I didn't expect us to break out in this way or that way? Was there anything off the radar that struck you about the TCU effort?
So offensively, no, not really. I think you saw a team that looked a little bit more like you had expected Oklahoma to look coming into the season. I think it was a little bit. I think a lot of people watching Caleb Williams in that Texas game, coming off of that game, number one was, did he and the Oklahoma team play that well, or was it Texas just really, really being surprised and not ready for him coming in? Probably was ready for him from a kind of a 3rd and short or 4th down, red zone specifically situation, but maybe not necessarily throughout the totality of the game. So there was some, not concerns, but maybe more so questions on how he would play against a defense that had been ready for him. So played, I mean, pretty flawless, to be honest, against TCU. The numbers were off the chart. 4 touchdown passes, 1 touchdown on the ground. I think over 350, 375 yards of total offense, maybe even more of that. I'm just kind of going off the cuff here. So I think that was, it looked like a team that was more in the mold of how they looked with a Jalen Hurts, or how they looked a little bit more with a Kyler Murray. So we'll see how that kind of transpires. Offensive line had their best game of the year, I think, in total. Rain was really good. You can tell he's getting a little bit more confidence. I think the communication is a little bit better. The right tackle Tyrese Robinson was a little bit banged up against Texas. Gave it a go. He played. He played like a guy that was injured. He didn't play great. He just the movement wasn't as strong as you would like. Eric Swinson came in and played pretty well. So I think Oklahoma 2 consecutive weeks that you've seen them run for over 200 yards. I think that's the recipe for success for Oklahoma to be able to open up the play action game, open up the deep throw, so the deep game. So I think that was really solid. I think overall receivers played well. Jaden Hazelwood had 3 touchdown receptions, something that you're excited about if you're an Oklahoma fan. So that's the that's the positive. The negative is the secondary. I think that the secondary is really the biggest concern on this team right now. We talked about this before. I think they rank 116th or 117th against the pass, 277 yards per game that they're giving up on average. So there's a little bit of a mixed bag on why that's happening. They've got specifically in this game against TCU, they had 3 of their top 4 secondary players out with an injury. DJ Graham went out in the concussion protocol early on, so they had moved Billy Bowman over from nickel to corner. Didn't really turn out very well. Got beat in coverage. And he's a true freshman, so you kind of expect that to a certain extent, especially moving positions in the middle of the week. But I think they desperately need to get they need to get healthy. So I think, I don't want to steal too much thunder about the importance of this game on Saturday, but I think to an extent, Oklahoma being able to get healthy on the back end, I think it is critical. Open field tackling was still a problem. Making plays on the ball in the air was continued to be a problem. So this was an area that Oklahoma, if there was any concern, I think on the defensive side of the ball, it was the secondary, particularly the corners, being able to replace what we're now seeing is 2 Trey Norwood and Trey Brown, those 2 guys that are playing on Sundays right now, which I don't know if we thought that would happen, but they've turned out to be pretty good thus far early on in the NFL season. So I think, missing those kids maybe a little bit more than maybe we thought to start the year. But yeah, that's something that Oklahoma has to get in order in quick fashion, because as we mentioned, they got a little bit of a reprieve here this week, but then you got Texas Tech the following week. But then you gotta buy to hopefully get healthy before you've got that stretch run in November that has bit. We thought it was going to be tough going in, but I think it's even a lot more tougher now than I think initially thought, with Baylor and Oklahoma State being much better than I think we thought coming into the season.
Yeah, Trey Norwood. I caught the Steelers game, some of it on Sunday night, and he showed up to play. He made some big plays in the game, and they were commenting that he was in the mix for them in regards to seeing, okay, out of this collection of guys, who's going to step up? And he's been the guy, and he certainly was on Sunday night. He made some really good open field tackles and disrupted some plays, definitely for the Pittsburgh Steelers. All right, Jason Ray's on the line, as he always is, to talk Oklahoma football with you. You can catch Jason on Last Word on College Football. Also, keep in mind that we've got our selections on Patreon. So we've got a 12-pack of games that we select among 20 media members on Patreon on our Voice of College Football community. And then I select all the top 25 games. And just to give you a little more to go on there, if I can find my 12-6 against the spread this past week. So 84 and 58 will do you pretty well. So give it a look. We've also got a whole lot more than just guys making predictions on our Patreon, Voice of College Football. But just go to Patreon, search MarkRogersTV, and you will find it right there. Before we move on to the question that was posed about Caleb Williams, because the same questions have been posed to me since the performance both against Texas and TCU. You mentioned the competition down the stretch. What do you make of Oklahoma State in particular, and really anyone else? We knew about Iowa State being a challenger before the season started. Baylor has certainly looked good, had another fine effort although they lost Oklahoma State a couple of weeks ago. But I saw a ton of the Oklahoma State-Texas game. That was my priority at noon on Saturday. And I got to say, despite it taking a long time to get that offense generated and Spencer Sanders pretty much bringing to the table what he typically does, both good and bad, my goodness, the defense looked really good. And once they kept pounding away at that running game, and it was extremely effective in the second half.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of interesting with Oklahoma State, Mark, based on the way they started the year, really struggled against Missouri State, then struggled again against Tulsa, could have easily lost a couple of those games, and even to a certain extent against Boise. But then since then, they've really turned it on, to your point. And I think obviously the defense is the difference. They were great against Casey Thompson. As good as Casey Thompson was against Oklahoma, Oklahoma State made him look equally as bad. A couple of interceptions, just a hair over 50% passing. So I think you've got to look. Interestingly enough, Iowa State and Oklahoma State probably the two best defensive teams in the conference right now, going against each other on Saturday. So, I think a big part of this as well. They've got a running back and I think Jalen Warren, I think is his name, who has kind of emerged as a bell cow for them. I think he had 38 carries against Texas on Saturday. So I think the one concern that I would have is if I'm Oklahoma State is, you've made this point. We've talked about this a lot. What Spencer Sanders are you going to get? It's hard to know from game to game, drive to drive, where he's going to be at. To your point, struggled a lot early on, a couple turnovers, and then late kind of got it going as well. So I think that's probably the one concern that you have if you're an Oklahoma State fan, just to see can you trust him, especially in a big game, which they're going to have another one obviously on Saturday. So I think if Oklahoma State wins that game, they're obviously, I think, in the driver's seat to make it to the Big 12 championship game, just based on their schedule that they have down the stretch. They go to Texas Tech, they go to West Virginia, so those are the tough games that they have outside of Bedlam, of course. So. And it's interesting, you have Oklahoma State number 8 in the country. I think this is a little flip flop in terms of what we thought this game would look like coming in. Iowa State unranked, but they've seemed to have maybe kind of hit their stride a little bit more based on what we expected. But these are some of these lines that you're much better at than I am in terms of picking against the spread. I remember at this very time last week we were having this conversation about Purdue and Iowa. And you're spot on. I don't remember what side you were on, but Iowa's that kind of team that they could easily, and they got pretty much dominated in that game. I watched almost every second of that game against Purdue, and so kind of the same thing here. Iowa State, obviously it's on the road. Iowa State unranked, Oklahoma State number 8 in the country, and I think Iowa State's 6.5, 7-point pick right now. So
yeah.
It's definitely the biggest. It might be the biggest game in the country this weekend, but certainly the biggest game in the Big 12.
Yeah, there might be some other teams that are a little shinier because of national reputation that people are going to gravitate to. But if you just take into consideration a conference race and implications on the championship game, I got to think that it is the most important game in the country this week. And just this Oklahoma State team, they interest me because they do play really good defense. And this Jalen Warren, he gained 154 yards in the second half of this game. But for as much as I try to deflect, because I think the quarterbacks are given too much of a weight on whether the particular team is going to be successful or not, I just can't get away from, for as much as I try to emphasize this Oklahoma State defense is good and they just pounded Texas in the run game in the second half. Yeah, Spencer Sanders, when like you made the comment, to paraphrase you, like he got it together in the second half. Like he wasn't lighting the world on fire in the second. He just made some simple throws. Like they were not anything incredible. So I don't want to place it all on him, but my goodness, they seem to be extremely strong in other facets of the game. But if your quarterback's just missing, the offensive line can block perfectly, the wide receiver can be open, and if the quarterback misses the throw, then the play's tanked, and that happens way too often with him.
Oh yeah, you're right. I mean, just looking at his stats right now, I mean, it's very, very average, right? I mean, he's completed just over 58% of his passes, which in today's day and age is not good at all for a starting, especially at the Power Five level. 6 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. So, yeah, I think, like I said, I think that would be the thing. Above all, yes, defense is very, very solid, specifically against the run. But really, it'd be really interesting this week. Texas, as the last 2 weeks, has really struggled finishing. Obviously against Oklahoma in the second half, and then again, particularly in the fourth quarter against Oklahoma State on this past Saturday. So, yeah, I mean, it could set up if Oklahoma State's able to win this game. One of the biggest bedlam games we've seen in a while, at least for the last few years. So it should be interesting. They've done a really good job at turning their season around, which looked to be a little bit shaky early on.
Absolutely. So we'll hit the live chat here. And this question was posed to me this weekend by a caller on our call-in show, where somebody said, like, it seemed pretty serious. Like he called in and said, like, he and somebody else were pretty much fighting about this, that one of them said, there's no way Caleb Williams can be invited to New York because he just started the 6th week or so of the season. There's no way he can get there. And then his buddy was adamant that he certainly had the opportunity. Well, I always am hesitant to predict. I'm okay predicting games, but to predict what other people are going to select, I kind of shy away from that. Like, who's going to win the Heisman Trophy? Well, I don't know what people are going to vote on. So when it comes to that, I think if people are looking at impact on the team, if people are looking at just playmaking ability, and if he continues to play at this level, then I believe that he could or should be selected to go to New York City. On the other hand, for those people that will just look at bottom line statistics, there's obviously no way he can make up ground statistically on other players. But if you look at the impact on the team, so far so good, and he may warrant a trip to New York City.
It's funny to talk about, Mark. I mean, to your point, it's hard to think about a kid that's played 7 legitimate quarters, maybe even, I mean, 6.5, and think that he's a Heisman candidate. But I had talked to and had seen some odds that I guess he's the 6th highest in terms of the odds. So I think the one thing to think about is, I think this year that we've seen, there hasn't really been anyone that's come out and just taken it, right? I think Bryce Young and Matt Corral are probably the 2 leaders right now. Then you've got the running back Bijan Robinson from Texas, and then certainly probably Kenneth Walker III from Michigan State right there. But other than that, there's not really been anyone that's came and seized control of it. So number one, the track record that Oklahoma has had at the quarterback position gives him an advantage. And I think number two, the big games that he's had over the last 2 weeks, I think the national stage kind of helped, obviously, against Texas, and then, the way he played this past week. I mean, he doesn't have he doesn't have the stats, but he does have, in really 2 games, not even a game and a half, 9 touchdowns accounted for in just that game and a half. So if the stats, to your point, Mark, aren't there. However, if he continues to play well, the stats can come. And I think the one thing that he might have to his benefit, Mark, is these last 3 games against Baylor, against Iowa State, and then against Oklahoma State, and then certainly the Big 12 championship game, if Oklahoma's able to get there, gives him that stage if he plays well. And I think everybody likes the story, just in general of, I mean, not necessarily anything against Rattler at all, but just specifically a true freshman getting at a place like Oklahoma, being able to play early on. First true freshman to make a start since I think Cale Gundy in 1990. Before that, I think it was 1985, Jamel Holloway. So I think the story in itself kind of lends itself to him possibly making it up there. But he does does have some work to do. But I think that just where the country is at from a Heisman perspective, and I think the one thing that he has going for him is Herb Street was pubbing him big time on the broadcast. I don't know how much you watched of the broadcast, but he made mention to it a couple of times, even so far as saying that he's a Heisman candidate right now. So I think those things help him, kind of nationally. So it'll be very interesting to see how this goes if he continues to play at the level that he's playing at now. Specifically, looking at the amount of time that he's played, he's already got about. And when you look at it, just kind of looking at the attempts, so Spencer Rattler has 175 attempts on the season. Caleb Williams has 59 attempts, almost half the amount of yardage through the air that Spencer Rattler had, and like I said, in just those amount of attempts. So he's much. I think he's much more efficient than Spencer Rattler has been. So yeah, and he does have the opportunity. The good thing, I think, for those that want him to get there, I think the good thing is he does have opportunities against two really subpar defenses over the next couple of weeks to get maybe caught up, so to speak, in some of those statistical categories.
You hit on an interesting point with Kirk Herbstreit in particular, but also other national and popular college football analysts jumping on this narrative, having their analysis of the play, but also the storyline is interesting, and that this is not an objective process. These are people voting that are biased, that some of them do extensive homework and take it extremely serious. Others, frankly, do not. They've got a credential. They've got a Heisman vote. They cover Washington. And I'm not, of course, picking on anyone particular that writes for the University of Washington. This is just random. They write for their team. They go to those games. They hear whatever they hear nationally or outside their conference. And if it strikes them as, oh, I better keep an eye on this Caleb Williams, or Herbstreit says that he's amazing. Oh, yeah. And they watched a couple highlights and he's suddenly on their radar, versus all sorts of different perspectives on it. It would alarm people that take college football serious to know the lack of accountability, the lack of research, knowledge, insight that some people that have the authority of at least having a Heisman vote in particular take.
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely right. And I think, and one of the other things to keep in mind here, as his counterparts, I guess, so to speak. And I think, obviously, I think we would agree that Bryce Young and Matt Corral probably are 1 and 2 right now. I think the thing also going for him is Bijan Robinson has the 2 losses. They're off this week. And the recency bias is always there. And I think the losses, and I don't put as much into this as it, because this award has really kind of turned into the best player on the best team, more than maybe necessarily the best player in college football overall. So I think the losses that Texas has had is going to hurt them. Then they come back and they go to Iowa State, their next game. So that will hurt. I mean, Kenneth Walker for Michigan State. It's just a tremendous story for him, but overall for Michigan State, no one thought they would be anywhere close to where they're at now. But they've got a couple of really tough games coming up, specifically against Michigan. And do they play Ohio State, or is it or maybe is it Penn State coming up? Anyways,
they will have Ohio State. I don't know exactly what the date is, but he's going to have to face Michigan, Penn State, and Ohio State.
So
out of the last 5 games of the year. Yeah.
So the opportunities there in terms of him inserting himself into the conversation. So it's crazy to think about a kid that just 2 weeks ago wasn't even going to see the field hardly at all, and then now he's being talked about as a Heisman Trophy candidate. But I think um, based on what you had said, Mark, just kind of from a media perspective and just what he's getting is it will be something that could certainly happen.
Jason Ray, last word on college football. Please check out his work right there. We're here talking Oklahoma football here each and every Wednesday, 11:30 a.m. Central Time. So, of course, we're gaining people as we go, but please be here on time at the beginning just so you don't miss anything. Obviously, if you do, no worries. You can go back once the video posts and catch it right there. So understand that I'm going to go through some of these questions, but Jason's already covered much of this territory, in particular the defensive backs in that situation there. Understand that you can be a beat writer for select your team, and I have those people on every week on various shows. They don't get detailed or much injury information. It's college football. Sometimes until they hit the field 15 minutes before kickoff, we don't know who's going to be available to play. Sometimes it's because it's legitimately not determined even by then to see how a player is going to respond on the field, making cuts, doing what they need to do right before the game. And sometimes for obvious strategic reasons, they want to keep it concealed the entire week.
Yeah. And I think to your point, Mark, I mean, Lincoln Riley's worse than most about concealing that. I would probably, just very quickly, I would expect DJ Graham to probably be back. He was in the concussion protocol during the game. Came out and said his parents came out on social media said that he did not end up having a concussion. So I would probably assume that he would be back against Kansas. Delarian Turner-Yell, from a safety perspective, is dealing with a hamstring issue. I would doubt very seriously that they rush him back. Probably get him back for Texas Tech. I don't know if some people might remember he actually came in and started early on against Texas, tweaked it a little bit, couldn't go, and obviously couldn't go this past week as well. So I think they'll probably save him for Texas Tech. I think the biggest one is Woody Washington's the biggest one. He hasn't played since early on in the season, and I think his is more interesting that I don't really have a good feel on based on, I think to your point, just not getting enough information. Anytime Riley's pressed about this, he had said he'll be out for a while. Don't really know what that means. I think best case scenario would have him, maybe back by the Baylor game if he's there. But Oklahoma's, I think they have there's a lot of concern, obviously, on the defensive secondary side, but I think they can get back to where they need to be if they get some of these kids back. And Jalen Redmond's another. He's not in the secondary, but defensive lineman's been out for a while. Probably would expect him back by Baylor as well. So Oklahoma, I think they'll be in a position to get a lot of these kids back, hopefully by the stretch run here in November.
Carvin Jackson here is crediting more so the running game and the offensive line as being the factors with the offensive improvement over the last few games and since Caleb Williams has taken over. So I'll throw in my 2 cents and then we'll turn it over to the expert. There is a tangible way to evaluate two quarterbacks: who can throw the ball better, more accurately, who has the stronger arm, who's more mobile, all the tangibles, physical skills. And then in addition to that, it's what does that player do in regards to decision making? This particular quarterback may have the better arm, more mobile, all those things, but they make horrible decisions. So we play a guy who's got an average arm, but he makes the right decisions because he's got playmakers and he's the right guy to at least distribute the football. So there's a physical component, and then there's a mental component that I just touched upon. And then there's something that really can't be measured, but it's one of the reasons why coaches should be and are paid at a certain rate, and that's this particular player, just especially at this position, quarterback, just has it. People respond to him. He leads the team. He inspires the team. The players around him play better. There's better chemistry, cohesiveness in the offense, and he's just got it maybe he's just got it, period, or with this particular collection of athletes, they just work better together. So that makes him a better fit.
Yeah, Mark, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think the biggest one is the intangible that you had mentioned on your last point on just the chemistry is better with Caleb Williams. And I'm not going to really say anything that is going to be surprising here, but anything that I've heard, Spencer Rattler's not a well liked kid. So I think that plays into it. And I'm not saying that he's a bad kid or anything like that. But I think, I think it shows itself on the sideline. It shows itself in how they played. So I think that's one side of it. They just seem to work a little bit better with Caleb Williams in the on the field. And I think the other thing, probably the most important thing, is just the threat of the run. Spencer Rattler is, I mean, he's not completely a statue, but he's not a viable threat in the QB run game. So that's not something that the defenses have to account for. You can, if you have a QB threat from a QB running threat, then you have to have a safety to kind of that has to come up and has to account for that guy, which opens up things in the passing game a little bit more. So I think um, one has affected the other. I think and another thing that you had mentioned is the decision making. Caleb Williams hasn't turned the ball over, in these game and a half, almost 2 games that he's played, really hasn't even come close to a turnover. So I think that is another thing that you talk about and you think about for Oklahoma, and it just jives better. You could tell that in the game against TCU, the play action game was a little bit stronger. You could tell the offensive line played a little bit better, and that remains to be seen, or remains to be told, I guess, whether or not it's one of those things where they're just naturally improving, or just everything that Oklahoma is doing with Caleb Williams just makes it a little bit better and run smoother. But Kennedy Brooks has ran better, so I think there's a little bit of both sides of it, Mark. But I think when you take into consideration all things considered, it's undeniable that the offense has played, much better. Just thinking of the last 6 quarters, what is this? 83 points, 35 against Texas and 52. Sorry, my math's wrong. So 35 against Texas and 52 against TCU, 87 points in the last game and a half. I think kind of speaks for itself in terms of how well the offense has played.
The last comment I'll make on that, and understand this comes from an old guy who loves the days in which Drew Bledsoe or Dan Marino would just stand in the pocket with just superior arm talent and just carve up a defense. But were they any threat to break, contain, and do anything outside the pocket? No. So to be that, and I'm not putting Spencer Rattler in that category. He's mobile. He can move around. He can run a little bit, but he's not a threat to the defense. Caleb Williams, I think the classic example was that 66-yarder against Texas. My goodness, that was a thing of beauty.
Mm-hmm.
That he just has that ability. So in today's game, we were talking this with Iowa football yesterday. They've got an immobile quarterback. And I just think that is such a disadvantage. And again, for as much as I love the guy that can stand in the pocket and deliver the ball, you better be like Peyton Manning. If you're going to be that player, you better be that good. And those guys are extremely rare. So, it's a 10-on-11 game with an immobile quarterback versus somebody determined. There was a number of people we could credit over the past 15 to 20 years that determined, man, sure, there was a liability a long time ago where we had running quarterbacks like Jamel Holloway that it looked ugly anytime they were going to try to throw the ball downfield. So that's the other extreme. But somebody determined, hey, we can find guys that can do both. And they put so much pressure on the defense that it's just the stress on the defense in the RPO game with a guy that's dynamic that can also throw the ball is just a game changer.
Yeah, no, you're right, Mark. I mean, in this day and age, you have to have at least a little bit of a threat. It doesn't necessarily have to be a true dual threat, but you have to have somebody that is a threat in the run game, at least to a certain extent. I mean, we talked about maybe the best comparison for something like this, a true freshman coming in the middle of the season, is Trevor Lawrence a few years ago. Now, I think us watching Trevor Lawrence, we would say yes, he is a typical drop back passer. However, he does have the ability to run. We saw that, certainly against Ohio State a few years ago as well. But he does have the ability to run. So that threat has to be there, whether or not he doesn't have to be like I said, a true dual threat, 600-700 yard rushing quarterback, but he does have to keep the defense honest from time to time. So I think that's something that, to your point, has to be in your repertoire as a quarterback these days.
We've got Russ chiming in here. What is wrong with Joshua Eaton and Latrell McCutcheon? Does Alex Grinch not see what we are watching? Jason Davis is not good. We have to let these guys have a chance. What are your thoughts?
Well, so a lot of those kids did have a can. So Jaden Davis and McCutcheon were the two main guys who played a lot. Billy Bowman played some, and I think the problem is, Russ. I think they're trying. I mean, I think they're trying these guys, and they're just not making the plays on the ball. And I think some of it, Jaden Davis, he's a kid who's been in the program for a while. He doesn't have as much of as an excuse as some of the other ones. I know that he's not as tall, but he's been there. He's played a lot of football for Oklahoma, so his play is a little bit perplexing. But um, when you look at some of the other kids that Oklahoma has had, Josh Eaton hasn't really played a whole lot. The other ones were the other players were our true freshmen. Latrell McCutcheon is a true freshman. Billy Bowman's a true freshman. So you've got to understand, I think, that in some respects, that those kids will have these growing pains. Going through their first time. I think the one thing that you see out of Billy Bowman, Latrell McCutcheon, I think they'll be good. I think Bowman's probably his strong suit is not necessarily, at the corner position. It's more so at the nickelback position. So I think the one thing to that point that we'll see is, I think Josh Eaton played a little bit better on the ball than some of those other kids. Specifically late in the game, he had an opportunity for an interception, but the TCU kid just kind of took it away from him. So I think you'll see him maybe play a little bit more. But yeah, I think those guys probably just quite aren't ready. But I think you'll see some of those other kids get an opportunity, and it's just though these beatings that they're taking just on one-on-one battles, I think will be invaluable for their career going forward. Obviously, it's not necessarily super valuable right now, but I think this experience that they're getting will do wonders down the road for them.
We love talking Oklahoma football with Jason Ray from Last Word on College Football, and all of you each and every Wednesday, 11:30 a.m. Central Time. We've got about 75 on the line. Appreciate everyone being here. And again, join Jason after each and every Oklahoma game to talk Oklahoma football. Weston, do you think Oklahoma can be a national title contender with everyone back on defense plus Theo Weiss? So I'm not going to put words in your mouth, Jason, but my take on what you had in regards to your mindset preseason was Oklahoma was a legitimate national championship contender. I was maybe a shade back from that, but I still ranked the team as one of the top 5 in the nation. Then to hear your analysis here, and it was pretty evident they weren't playing like that for a long, long time. Where do you think they stand right now?
So I think it's important to just look at the national landscape as we answer this question. I mean, I think we all clearly know. I think there's a lot of people here that will question the offenses that Georgia has faced up to this point in the season, but I think they're clearly the best team in the country. So I think that getting that out of the way, and then outside of that, you've got a bunch of people, you got a bunch of these teams that are really jumbled together. I would argue that Ohio State's probably playing better than anyone in the country outside of Georgia right now. However, they've beaten up on some teams that aren't necessarily your top contenders in the Big Ten. So we'll see. I think obviously they go to Indiana, and they've Indiana's not anywhere near the team that they were a year ago. But I think, what is it, next week they do have Penn State. They do host Penn State. So you'll see some of that worked out. So I think, to answer the question, Weston, I think they can be. I think they can be a contender, because I think it's so even. I think right now, if the season ended today, we would see an Oklahoma and Cincinnati matchup, and I think that's what you probably hope for if you're Oklahoma. You're probably rooting for Georgia to run the table, beat Alabama, so they are, out of the playoff conversation, by and large, unless something crazy happens, and then you've got Oklahoma and Cincinnati, and probably whatever Big Ten team emerges, uh, whether it be Ohio State, whether it be Penn State. It's going to be very, very difficult, even for Iowa. I mean, if they win the Big Ten championship, I mean, they're probably would find their way back in, but that's just a really, really bad loss at home against Purdue. So yeah, I think they can be. I think they can be a national championship contender, if that play continues on the offensive side of the ball, and the defense either improves, or they get some of those guys back in the secondary. But it's very intriguing. I mean, you've got to, if you're just kind of going away from Oklahoma just for a second, but if you're a Cincinnati fan, you got to be tickled right now. I mean, you've done the things that you need to do, and then you've got some breaks that I think you've that have headed your way that you didn't necessarily anticipate, with Alabama losing that game, and obviously Cincinnati are probably the biggest Georgia fans in the country right now. But I think I think some of those conversations will be interesting as the season goes on, because Cincinnati doesn't. I mean, I think they go to SMU. I think that might be their only true test the rest of the year. But I think the problem is for Cincinnati, which, I mean, at 2, they will get a little. I mean, it will be interesting to see what the committee thinks of them versus um, what the AP thinks of them. But I think one of the things that's going to be, like we see every year with a team like that, they're going to be forgotten to a certain extent down the stretch, because they won't have a high quality game. And even SMU, I mean, they're ranked, but it doesn't move the needle as much as you would think. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out, throughout the remainder of the year.
And for Cincinnati, God forbid if SMU starts losing some games, because they're not some kind of dominant football team. They're a good team. They're probably, I don't think they're one of the 25 best teams in America. I do have them ranked there because they're undefeated, but shoot, they needed a Hail Mary to beat Louisiana Tech. They're a top 40 team in the country. So they may step into conference play further and lose a couple games, and suddenly Cincinnati's win over them isn't anything special. So I have a hard time with Cincinnati, because I have been one person that's been on here ever since the playoffs started, defending, advocating for the little guy, for the group of 5 team, for the UCF, for the Cincinnati last year, that why are we playing? Why are these teams playing if they win every game and they can't get in the playoff? Well, the answer is not to shove them into a 4-team playoff when they play an extremely weak schedule. It's to expand the playoff, in my opinion, because I would hate to see a Cincinnati team go undefeated and not be given an opportunity. But at the same time, their schedule is horrendous. It's not good. Like, I hear people, Jason, talking about Wake Forest and what a joke it is that they're 6-0 and all that. And I get it, but that's a Power 5 discussion. That's elevating them. If I did a comparison in a video a couple weeks ago between Wake's schedule and Cincinnati's, and for as bad and weak as the ACC is, once it's all said and done, if Wake can run the table, which is an enormous if, I don't think anybody expects it, but they're 6-0. If they can make it 7 more games, their schedule strength is so much better than Cincinnati's. For some reason, people think, okay, Cincinnati beat Notre Dame, And the same people that seem to say Notre Dame's really not that good this year, but that's Cincinnati's marquee win.
Right.
And like that they kind of pass the test. And while everybody else has to pass like 6 or 7 tests, Cincinnati only has to pass one, and they're good to go and they're in. They're not even playing Memphis and Houston in their conference, who are
Right.
probably the 3rd and 4th best teams below SMU at this point. And that's not their fault, but
Yeah.
they're either going to play like SMU twice, meaning in the conference championship game, or they're going to get Memphis or Houston, probably Houston in the championship game. But again, you're beating a top 40 or 50 team in the country.
It's so intriguing, Mark. I mean, just to think about, yeah. I mean, and obviously, I mean, it helps them a little bit if Notre Dame, wins out and continues
Yep.
to win. I mean, they'd probably like to see Indiana play a little bit better than they have, just because of the fact that coming into the season, Indiana was probably a fringe top 25 team. Maybe they were ranked in the top 25, but yeah, I think that this. I don't think there's a lot of difference, in terms of your conversation about Wake Forest. It doesn't seem like there's a ton of difference between the ACC and the AAC right now, this year. I mean, the ACC is still stronger, obviously, but probably not by much, with Clemson kind of coming back down further than they've been in a long time. But to your point, you've got Wake Forest now. Could if Wake Forest goes undefeated, could they? I think they're probably a little bit too far back at this point, but who knows? Who knows what would happen? I don't know. It's very. If you're a Cincinnati fan, and if this situation just continues to go, the way that we think it might go. Let's just say, for instance, Alabama loses to Georgia. You only have one SEC team. You have one presumably Big 12 team, whether it's Oklahoma or maybe Oklahoma State or whoever, and then you have one Big 10, and then you have another spot open for maybe another at-large SEC, another at-large Big 10 team, and you're Cincinnati and you're sitting there undefeated. I don't know if you'll say that you could ever, will we ever be able to get in if that's the case? So I completely agree with you. The schedule is yeah. I mean, part of it's unlucky in the AAC that they did not have the opportunity to play Memphis or Houston, to your point, but yeah, they better hope like hell that SMU continues to win before that game, because they need to have that game, and they need to be very dominant in that game to be there.
And to your point, Wake Forest right now is, I don't know what they are. I don't look at the national polls. I've got them at, I believe, 12, but I think they're more like 16 in the AP, something like that. Okay, this is only one of the huge fallacies. First of all, let's understand that the college football playoff rankings come out November 2nd, and there is supposedly no connection between what we see in the AP and the coaches poll and what they're going to select. Again, I would love to see some kind of study to see how closely they are reflected. But it's almost like we've got the preseason perception, and as long as the team doesn't mess up, they're going to hold their spot. And so that's an issue that I have, is like you made the statement, and it's not a knock on you. It's actually, you're telling the way it is. Wake Forest might be too far back. Well, what did they do to get too far back? They won all their games. They just didn't start in the top 25. So it's a completely ridiculous system where you almost hold your spot, like Oklahoma did early in the year. I didn't have Oklahoma ranked anywhere close to a top 10 because they weren't performing at top 10 level. But everyone else, since they started 3 or 4, maybe they moved them down a little bit because the performances were awful. Where now I've got Oklahoma in the top 3 in the country because other teams have lost and they continue to win, and now more impressively. So people are like, why did you just all of a sudden Oklahoma's? Well, and that's just like Cincinnati. They will continue to win, but most likely in my rankings, they will drop spots, and people will be all over me and say, how could they drop from 7 to 8 this week since they won? Well, their resume, in comparison to everyone else, is continuing to decline as they play weak opponents and other teams' resumes. If they're winning the games, will build. Ohio State's resume is not good right now. It's going to shoot through the roof when they
Absolutely.
play Penn State, Michigan State, Purdue, Michigan. And other teams are just like it because now they're playing conference schedules and difficult games, and they're the teams that are going to win the games down the stretch. Their resumes are going to shoot up, and Cincinnati's is going to plummet.
Yeah, I was just kind of while we were talking here, Mark, just looking at Wake Forest's schedule, and if they run the table here,
Last 4 games.
yeah, I mean to your point, I mean this weekend's not going to be an easy one at Army, but to your point, they host NC State, they go to North Carolina, go to Clemson, go to Boston College. I mean, you win those 3 games, I think you deserve to at least be in the conversation.
And
Absolutely.
then the championship game.
Yeah, and whoever that might be, right? So yeah, no, and I think that's fair, and I think, and this is kind of the because it's so subjective to your point on the I mean, we talked about the Heisman being so subjective that the college football playoff rankings is equally subjective. So for an example, let's say let's just throw out the scenario at SEC champion Alabama runs the table the rest of the way. Um, Georgia beats them by, let's just say, 3. Alabama has 2 losses. Cincinnati is undefeated. I think from a record perspective, you look at, how do you reward a team that's lost 2 games over a team that's undefeated, for one. But then the other school of thought is when you look on the field, you can tell Alabama's a better football team than what Cincinnati is. So, and that's just the problem with it being so subjective. And so it'll be interesting. I don't think the committee would be willing to deal with the backlash that they would get if they put a 2-loss Alabama team in over an undefeated Cincinnati. But I mean, crazy things could happen. Crazier things could happen. Like, you know, I don't know. I mean, even aside that conversation, what if we have a one, and maybe let's just say there's one spot to give a 1-loss Alabama SEC championship winner over against a 1-loss Ohio State Big Ten championship winner. Like, that's more of the. I mean, to me, that's more of the interesting conversation if it got to that point. Obviously, Georgia would still be in, but then you have Alabama and Ohio State, and maybe Oklahoma and Cincinnati are the other 2 that you're thinking about. So um, that would be an interesting conversation.
It's strange to me. Again, it goes back to name recognition and what we believe these teams to be more so than what they're actually doing on the field, that we have to try to defend a Wake Forest Power 5 champion that's undefeated. So we're not even talking about a 1 loss. So there's only been 2 occasions. So there have been no occasions in which an undefeated Power 5 team missed the playoffs, obviously.
Mhm.
But there have only been 2 occasions where a conference champion with 1 loss did not make the playoffs. So you had the TCU Baylor situation in 2014 and Ohio State in 2018 when it came down to Ohio State, Oklahoma. Ohio State got left out as a 1-loss Big Ten champion. So we're talking about an ACC winner, undefeated, being left out of the playoff, let alone a 1-loss. I even think if they lose 1 game and win the ACC, they should be heavily considered.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, when you think about this, I mean, we were debating the schedules. The schedules aren't even close, just in terms of, and I don't have Cincinnati's up in front of me right
It's
now. But
awful.
like I said, and I know, before I've looked at it before and know that SMU is the toughest, by far, and there's no real even opportunity for an upset, even if they play bad. But you go and then you win, and you go to North Carolina, Clemson, Boston College, and 3 of your last 4 games, and you go through that undefeated. And to your point, whoever they play in the ACC championship game, there's a valid argument that could be made. So, like I said, Cincinnati's done they're very appreciative, I think, of some of the things that have fallen their way, but I think they probably need a few more things to happen just to at least solidify themselves as a participant.
What's interesting about this too, Jason, is that we tend to value teams that so now that we're in conference play, let's all understand that the math says that every conference finishes 500. So they all finish 500. So once they start playing in conference, the conference play only from a reasonable logical standpoint only tells us whether the conference is top heavy or balanced or whatever. The results are all the same. They're all 500. So in this scenario with Wake Forest, the teams that they're playing, the record, the aggregate composite record is going to be the same regardless. But in terms of the perception, what they need is they need the couple teams that have the opportunity to have really good records to have really good records instead of a bunch of muddled like 7-5 teams that they beat.
Mm-hmm.
People won't care if they beat a couple 4-8 teams if a couple of those teams like NC State go like 10-2.
Yep.
And people be like, well, they beat a couple 10-2 teams. They don't care that they beat like they're supposed to a couple 4-8 teams, as opposed to them all beating each other and they won a bunch of 7-5 games against those type teams.
Yeah.
When in fact, the composite of the difficulty of that is roughly the same. So it's just the perception of it's interesting.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit. I mean, into Weston's comment, yeah. I mean, OU runs the table. They're gonna jump Cincinnati. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And that's the same thing that might happen for some of these other. You mentioned Ohio State. You know, their resume is going to start getting stronger. They will be a team that would likely jump Cincinnati as well. So, and I was mistaken here looking at Cincinnati's schedule. I thought they went to SMU, but no, they host SMU. So that even diminishes that game even a little bit more, than it would previously, because their road game, they go to Navy, to Tulane, host Tulsa, to South Florida, host SMU, and then go to East Carolina. So, yeah, no, I think that schedule is going to present a problem for them going forward if some of the dominoes don't fall the way that they need to.
Look at what may turn out to be the Ohio State-Oregon argument.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about recency bias or brand name bias or whatever eyeball take on this, Ohio State has already surpassed Oregon. So they both have the same record. They're 5-1. Oregon traveled across the country and beat Ohio State in Columbus in a game that was close, but it wasn't razor close, that Oregon controlled. And Ohio State's already eclipsed them without even playing anybody decent, has already eclipsed them in the rankings because Oregon hasn't looked impressive. Ohio State has, but they've beat up on a bunch of nobodies, and they've already eclipsed them. And that will just get stronger and stronger if you look at reason, and I'm a big resume guy, but it's hard for me to get past Oregon, Pac-12 champion, 1 loss, Ohio State Big Ten champion with 1 loss. Oregon traveled across the country and beat them in Columbus head to head. Shouldn't that be the tiebreaker?
You would think so. I mean, I think logic would dictate that. I mean, and to your point, I mean, Oregon had a little bit of an OU issue in terms of, they really haven't played a solid game outside of Ohio State game. They beat lucky to beat Cal, this week.
Yeah.
Very fortunate. Then they lost to Stanford, and then they beat I think Arizona by 3 touchdowns, but they were a beneficiary of about 5 or 6 turnovers in that game. So, yeah, I mean, what does that look like? At the end of the year, again, it's just the kind of subjective conversations that these people have in terms of the committee. Do you reward Ohio State for playing well down the stretch and beating some of these teams and improving, but at the same time look at the end of the year and look at an Oregon team that's 8-4, maybe. And I'm not saying that's what they'll end up, but I'm saying, they have a really tough schedule down the stretch starting this weekend. They go to UCLA, and then they go to Washington, and then they go to Utah as well. So, those are some tough games. So it's gonna. I think it's gonna shape up for. We were clamoring. So much of us were clamoring for some craziness, and I think we'll have it if some of these things, you know, pan out the way that we think that they could. Um, I mean, there's a lot, and I don't know if you kind of get that throughout your, specifically your national talk. There's a lot of, not just here, but I think there's a lot of regional talk here in kind of the Big 12 country of, yeah, Georgia's pretty good, but they haven't played an offense with a pulse. I don't really buy it, honestly. I mean, obviously they're not going to play an offense. Maybe Tennessee may give them a little bit of problems, but I mean they're not gonna play an offense at that level until Alabama in the SEC championship game, if that's who they end up playing. But still, I think their defense is so good at all three levels, that I don't really see that being an issue. I mean, even if you're not playing some of the best offenses in the world already, they're they're giving up 6 points a game. Six,
Yeah.
that's unheard of in this day and age. So
Yes.
I've watched them several times, and it's one of the and I may get some arguments here, but it's one of the best defenses I've seen in college football probably the last 5 years or so.
Arkansas's offense was effective against Texas A&M and Texas and put up 51 points in a loss against Ole Miss. And I know Ole Miss, that everyone will move the argument down the road. I know Ole Miss's defense isn't really that good, all that, but still. And then they can't like get a first down against Georgia. Like, Georgia's been that dominant, and I do believe that Arkansas is a quality team. Are they as good as what they were showing us weeks ago? Maybe not. I never thought that they were a top 5 team in the country, but
Right.
they're one of the 25 or 30 best teams in the country. And Georgia's just, yeah, they are just, Clemson's having their offensive issues, but they're a talented team with talented players, and they couldn't even run their offense. They scored 3 points.
Yeah.
It's just, they're just, and I'll balance that observation with all the people that contact the main channel and talk on the national scale that just talk like they've won the national championship already. It's done. Well, okay, they're not invincible. That doesn't mean I don't want my words to come back and bite me. That doesn't mean that they're not going to win a national championship and be undefeated, like has happened the last 2 years with LSU and Alabama. They may be able to accomplish that. But Alabama was challenged by Ole Miss and Florida, and LSU was challenged by Auburn and Alabama and others, Clemson to a certain extent in the championship game. So I think Georgia's challenges are coming. I don't think they're going to steamroll the entire schedule all the way through a national championship game.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, every one of those teams has one of those forks in the road that they have to figure out. There's going to be a game here where their defense doesn't play as well as they've played in the past, and offensively they'll struggle. So yeah, no, absolutely, I agree with you. I think there's going to be a game, whether it's the SEC championship game or whether it's even before then. Maybe it's next week against Florida. Who knows? I didn't think Florida was capable of scoring as many points as they scored against LSU. So maybe they can do some things offensively to hurt to hurt Georgia. So who knows? I mean, that's the one thing that we've learned. If we learned anything about this year, to kind of expect the unexpected. I know that's very cliche-ish to say, but yeah, I think that's that's something to think about. However, the one caveat I would say about Georgia is, if Florida's not able to give them to challenge them, I think probably Tennessee might be the only team left on their schedule through the
Yeah.
maybe Georgia Tech. I bet I know they're improved a little bit, but probably not. But so I think, but yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch for sure.
I'm not picking on the Rod Farva here, because I think it's a legitimate question, and it's what we do here is talk about college football and all sorts of possible matchups and so forth. But I find it interesting because most of the comments that come my way, especially from my top 25 rankings, are people discrediting them by saying, well, so and so would beat so and so would beat so and so. Well, who would win this game? Alabama, Texas A&M. Who would win that game? Well, we saw it 2 weeks ago, and nobody in the world thought Texas A&M was going to win that game. I had nobody, even Oregon people. Every Oregon person I had, both fan and media person, thought they were going to get drubbed by Ohio State or were hoping to stay close.
Mm-hmm.
They were a 2-touchdown, 15-point underdog. Who would win, Oregon or Ohio State? Well, Oregon won in Columbus.
Right.
But most people still think if they played again, Ohio State would win.
Oh, yeah.
So, and I'm included, but I'm trying to take what I think out of the equation. So I always enjoy these questions or the criticisms. Well, your rankings don't make sense because so-and-so would beat so-and-so. Well, we can give you who would win, Purdue or Iowa. Well, before last Saturday, everybody thought Iowa would win.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Mark. It's crazy to look at these, but I think I'm just incredibly excited about these games down the stretch. I think they're going to be November is going to be some of the best football we've seen in quite some time. Even looking at Ohio State, and I don't think we can go a week without mentioning this, but I just increasingly every single week I feel more and more bad for Nebraska. Just their it's unlike anything I've ever seen, Mark. Their ability to find new ways to lose football games is just astonishing. But it would probably be on par for them to find a way to beat. I know I don't want to wish anything bad on you here, Mark, but I mean it would be it would be so on brand, I guess, and so just kind of appropriate for them to find a way to beat Ohio State and Lincoln at some point this year. But man, they find ways to lose more than any team I've ever seen.
Jason, I tweeted out at some point, I said, schedule the Kansas City Chiefs, schedule the Yukon Huskies. Nebraska is going to lose by 1 score regardless.
Yep.
This particular game against Minnesota, I watched almost the entire game. They were their own worst enemies, though, in this. Well, that could be stated almost every game. But in this particular game, Jason, they get completely outplayed in the first half, 21-9. Mm-hmm. They come back. They make it a 21-16 game. Early fourth quarter. So still plenty of time in the game. But, hey, we're in the fourth quarter, 10, 12 minutes left. They have 3 consecutive drives where they do this. The first drive, they make it down to the 1-yard line. They have a 1st and goal at the 5. They run basically the same run play 4 consecutive times and just get stuffed over and over and over. Like, did play action never come into their minds at any point? 4 consecutive run plays from inside like the 2-yard line. And the last of those plays, the 4th down play, they had a running back, Ramir Johnson, who had like a 90-yard game. He was the guy gaining the yardage. They bring in a freshman running back who rarely carries the ball, give it to him on 4th down, and he like trips in the backfield, and that. So that's one drive. Then they stop Minnesota, boom, at the 2-yard line. So they're in great shape. They get the punt. They're at midfield. They're back roll. First play, 40 yards down to the 15. 40-yard pass play. They're in business. They're right back there like 45 seconds later. They run the ball 3 consecutive times. After they hit on a 40-yard pass play, they run the ball 3 consecutive times, get nothing, lose 2 yards. They're 3rd and 12. Okay. So on 3rd and 12, if you're going to run the ball and you're in plus territory, you're in the red zone, I'm thinking that you are setting up a 4th down to go for it. If you're going to run the ball, what's the percentage possibility that you're going to convert 3rd and 12 running the ball? It's probably 5%.
Yeah, very low.
They get 8 yards on that 3rd and 12 running the ball. What do you think they did?
And then they
Tried a
kick it.
field goal.
Yeah.
What do you do? And they missed it. They missed a 27-yard field goal on 4th and 4 after they ran the ball for 8 yards. So then the third time they get the ball back, this is all between like 12 minutes left in the fourth quarter and like 5 minutes left in the fourth. It's still a 21-16 game.
Yeah.
They get to 4th and 10 in field goal range. Still plenty of time left in the game. Over 7 minutes left in the game. On 4th and 4, the previous drive, they try the field goal. On 4th and 10, they go for it. An incomplete pass. What are they doing?
I don't know. And I was just looking here. They've lost 5 games by a total of 28 points. So they, like I said, they find. I mean, and that's really, and like I said, I didn't watch the game at the, certainly not at the level that you did, but just kind of looking at that as, I mean, that's just a lot of bad coaching, obviously coaching decisions there, but yeah, they're just finding new ways to lose every single week, and it's just, I mean, and it's probably going to cost him his job. I mean, I don't know. I mean, when they're in serious they're in serious trouble of being being able to get bowl eligible. They've got Purdue, Ohio State, Purdue, Ohio State, Wisconsin, and Iowa left. So they've got to win 3 of those games, right?
They got to go
3
and
and
1.
So I mean, I don't know that they'll win one of them. So I don't know. I mean, if you're Scott Frost and you throw out a 3-9 season, no matter if you lose them close or lose them by a large margin, it's going to be hard to see them survive that.
It's something else. Yeah, it is something else. Oklahoma and Kansas. We talked nothing about this game, and I don't know that we need to, but is there anything with this Kansas football team? I got to look up this. It seems like every week they lose a Big 12 game like 45-12. It's basically what I see.
So I think it would make it much easier on us, Mark, if you would put whoever Kansas is playing on our pick sheet every single week. So
yeah, I should probably bolster our record that way.
No, you're exactly right. They have they've only won one game, obviously the first game of the season against South Dakota, and they were pretty fortunate to win that game. But no, they really haven't been. I mean, in any Big 12 game this year, they haven't been competitive. 45-7 loss to Kansas, 59-7 loss to Iowa State, 41-14 loss to Texas Tech. So, I mean, I think here's the biggest thing about this game, I think, Mark, is if Oklahoma is even remotely interested in this game, then it's probably one of those games that they're up by 5-6 touchdowns early in the second half, and Rattler gets to actually play a little bit, and just kind of just keep himself fresh. So I think the biggest problem is going to get them to be interested in this game, because you come off to obviously the Texas game is always an emotional game. And then I think the emotion of inserting Caleb Williams into the starting lineup and coming back home was really an emotional game. So I think there's going to be a little bit of a letdown against Kansas. I don't think there's any way there can't be coming off of that. None of these kids are going to be excited even a little bit to play in this game. I mean, maybe the most excitement is just to see some of the the second and third teamers play a little bit more. But I think focus is it's one of the things that Oklahoma has struggled with from time to time, and focus on every single opponent, not necessarily playing down to the level of their opponent. So I think that's the biggest challenge, I think, for Oklahoma coming into this game, is being able to play at a high level when maybe you're not as excited as you would be against the Texas or an Oklahoma State or Iowa State or whoever that might be.
sometimes at the end of a long college football Saturday or sometime on Sunday or Monday, you know how they have those condensed highlights on YouTube, like a 12-minute package that's pretty extensive. You can get a feel for the game, but obviously you can't sit there for 3 hours. And I'll pick out like some game that's completely off the radar. Like I'm following the biggest games, the biggest teams all day Saturday, but I'll just be like, I want to see what happened in this Stanford Washington State game. I'm just gonna watch this. So I watched the extended highlights. I remember on the Kansas Duke game, and Kansas was leading most of that game, and then they had like a 2-score lead like midway through the second half, and then all of a sudden it just became a comedy circus of just scooping scores and pick sixes, and they gave up like 5 touchdowns in like a quarter, and, and it just got away from them.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I will say for Kansas is I think they got a good guy there. If they're willing to give him time,
Yeah.
I think he'll maybe to a certain extent turn that around. It's so hard to believe. I'm trying to remember. You probably remember how long it's been since Mangino was there. I mean, it's 20 plus. Well, not quite 20 years at this point. Probably. I mean,
07 was the big season
07.
that
So
they had.
it's hard to believe how fast this this program has fallen. Consistently one of the worst teams in the definitely the worst Power 5 team, I would say, but one of the worst teams in the FBS. It's just at some point, I mean, and they don't have a rich tradition, but they have a decent tradition of good football. I mean, at some point they're going to turn it around to be respectable. It's just when is that going to be is the biggest question. I mean, I think they will. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to be next year or the year after, but or maybe not even under Leopold. But I think at some point they're going to turn it around at some point. But it'll be when will that be is the big thing.
All right, folks, that was our big Kansas preview right there. So join Jason after the game against the Jayhawks, and I'm guessing that conversation is going to drift quickly into the college football playoff scenario.
It will. I think either that or something else. There'll probably be very little conversation about Kansas, and I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's beneficial for team. I mean, I think every conference has this to a certain extent, right? I mean, SEC has Vanderbilt. Big 12 obviously has Kansas. Gosh, I don't even know who the Big Ten would be right now. I think traditionally it had been Rutgers, but they're not quite as they have been in the past. But still, every conference seems to have that team that they not necessarily have a bye, but a team that they can maybe not necessarily be at their best and still perform well against. So it's necessary, but I think it's one thing. The one thing I would say is I think the schedule works out pretty well for Oklahoma, just being able to have this game and then Texas Tech and then the bye before their big November schedule that they have those three back to back to back.
Right, folks, we appreciate everyone being here, and consider contributing through the Super Chat, or you can hit me up at MarkRogersTV on Venmo, PayPal, and Cash App. I would just ask that you would make a notation that it's for the Oklahoma channel in particular, right here at the Voice of College Football. Appreciate everybody being here. We'll be back next Wednesday, 11:30 a.m. Central Time, and of course, join Jason after the game. Yes, you will talk Kansas football, and I'm sure break down the second and third offensive line depth chart for the Jayhawks. No, you'll have a great conversation, whether it's 65-7 or whatever the score is after the ball game. Actually, Jason, I just remembered that you've got actually something bigger in store that you're planning on Saturday.
Yeah, so I think we're actually going to push that to the following
Okay.
Saturday. I had some personal things I won't be able to commit to a full day, but yeah, I think we're planning on doing that the following week. So.
Okay. So stay with us on that, and we'll announce more on Jason's content plans coming up in a week or two. All right, everyone. Appreciate you being here. We will see you next week on Oklahoma Sooners Live.